Welcome, everyone, this evening. It's a great joy to be back on campus. My name is Father Spencer Howe, and I'm a 2009 alumnus of the University of St. Thomas. I studied philosophy and Catholic studies and classical languages. And I look for opportunities to come back to campus because I love the years that I spent here, grateful for the formative experiences that I had. I was in that building that many people don't know the name of. You know, it's that building kind of between Ireland Hall and Selby or whatever the building is next door, the seminary. Some people, I remember even on a college tour that I was on once upon a time, someone said, "What building is that?" And the person answered back, "We're not really sure what goes on there." So, but I survived 4 years at St. John Vianney, and I don't know if we have any seminarians here in the house tonight, but I know that we have some undergraduates, and that's a fabulous thing. That was our desire, to host this night on campus so that we could make more contact with students and bring the Roca Seca Project, which is the alumni association that I helped to establish about 5 or 6 years ago, to kind of bring it more onto the campus to make connections. And so really what we're doing is building momentum and making connections. There's a lot of resources you can pick up as you're coming and going tonight. But I really want to just thank you for taking the time tonight, whether you're coming from off campus, whether you're a friend of the university, whether you're an alumni, whether you're already familiar with our work at the Roca Seca Project, or whether you just happen to be here tonight because you heard there were snacks and you're a student and you kind of go anywhere you can to find food that's being given out. So whatever it was that brought you here, I'm grateful. I want to just say on behalf of the Roca Seca Project, I serve as a board member and kind of the chaplain. I'm really grateful you're here. A number of our members, our core members, are away, and so we're kind of a skeleton crew tonight. I want to thank Matt Slattery for his presence, and Gail Clark, and Taylor, who's outside, and I think that might be all of us who are formally part of the Roca Seca team. All of us are alumni of the university, and we're all committed to staying in relationship in ongoing ways, and I'll say a little bit more about Roca Seca in just a bit. But I wanted to give an opportunity for the other organization that is sponsoring tonight, Tommy Catholic. I wanted to give them an opportunity to say a word, and we have just the man. So we have Marcin, who's going to just say a word. He's a frequent flyer at Tommy Catholic. I just met him this evening. He's not named after Marcian, not named after the heretic who rejected the Old Testament. He's named after, I'm sure, a Christian saint. So just come and say a word about yourself, and then I'll continue on with the introduction. But grateful to have students, and I hope that you know about Tommy Catholic. I commend it to your attention.
Thank you. My name is Marcin, not Marcius. No heresy. I'm a senior studying philosophy, psychology, and Catholic studies. I don't know how I managed that in 4 years, but I did. So here we are. I've been on the Tommy Catholic Planning Committee. It's our organization that plans our Tommy Catholic events, which are held every Tuesday from 8 to 9. We're a triage of 3 organizations, SPO, St. Paul's Outreach, Catholic Studies, and Campus Ministry that all come together every Tuesday to host different events about God, our faith, different topics. So a couple topics this year. We had a 4-part series on theology of the body, talking about theology of the body, universal call to holiness, marriage and family, and priesthood, a religious life, and single life. So we just finished that up, and a couple upcoming is we have a social media night hosted by Catholic Studies and Divine Trust coming up, 2 different topics that we're trying to go deep. And essentially, every Tuesday we dive deep into one topic and kind of explore it and bring it to the faithful on campus and try to spread the word of God. And that's basically our program, yeah. Hand it back.
Tommy Catholic is a student-run organization, and we're grateful for the desire that they have to help unite Catholics on campus and those who are seeking and discovering and learning. I was a part of the Catholic Studies Leadership Interns program as a chaplain visiting from off campus, and a number of those leadership interns through Catholic Studies were a part of the formation going back a number of years to the beginnings of Tommy Catholic. But we're grateful for the sessions that you host, usually in the Iverson Center for Faith on Tuesday evenings. So they're interrupting their usual programming to share this evening with us and we're grateful for that. I wanted to point out and thank Sarah, who works with Campus Ministry, for Campus Ministry, as the liaison for Tommy Catholic, and we're grateful for your work in helping us prepare for tonight. Thank you, Sarah, for your presence. Wanted to thank Father Blake as well for his presence, Father Litke. There's some good campus coming together, but there's also people, again, from outside. Just a word about Roca Seca before I begin with the introduction of our speaker, Dr. Todd Warner. The whole idea of the Roca Seca project is to remember that St. Thomas Aquinas came from somewhere. Like we have a birthplace, a birth town, so did Thomas Aquinas. And so the whole idea of Roca Seca, a project dedicated to this town, which is called the Dry Rock. It is a hard name sometimes to pronounce, but you just have to maybe think in that Italian accent, Roca Seca, it's a very nice name. But the idea of the dry rock, the idea of that place where a saint came from. And it reminds us of origins. It reminds us that we all have an origin. And it also reminds us of God's call and God's plan and God's purpose. I'm not certain of the church where Thomas was baptized, but I do know that he was given at the beginning of his life everything that would unfold throughout his life. So in that sense, the idea of a birthplace, a birth town, reminds us of origins. It takes us back to our origin, but it also helps us to consider the origin of this university. The reason that we're all here, even tonight, in this incredible building, this Anderson Student Center, is in fact because of the legacy, because of the clarity of teaching, because of the intensity of the love of God, of this one human being, this one man, Thomas Aquinas. So the idea is to really celebrate his patronage, to remind the university of how wonderful it is that we have so strong a patron, and we hope that within the areas of ongoing intellectual formation and prayer and sacraments and devotion and ongoing opportunities for fellowship and fraternity, that we will have lots of opportunities to live in that legacy, to come to know him, to come to love him, to come to learn about him. So as I mentioned, we've been running for a number of years now, I think 5 or 6 years, could even be longer. We went dormant for a while, like a lot of organizations did, but we're back, and we're back stronger than ever. So you'll be able to pick up cards, business cards. You can leave your emails. You can pick up a trifold. You can pick up a flyer. We have several different ways to get a hold of us, and we would love to be able to get a hold of you and keep you connected. We do have a number of students on campus that we know. I see a few of them here tonight, so thank you for your presence and for spreading the word. We're super excited about what's going on campus, and we want to be a part of it. So even though my years at St. Thomas are gone, and I have to kind of reminisce and come back now and again, we really want to be in connection and relationship. If you have ideas for how we can be more helpful, more supportive, we just want to be part of things. And we are independent of the university, but we really want to be in support of our alma mater. It's about love that we have. And hopefully we offer something as well, make a contribution along the way. There is a new arrival in our merchandise, which there's no cost, so it's not really merchandise. We have a fantastic little holy card that was designed with a prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to invite all of you to take one of those and consider St. Thomas in a new way, a patron for you, wherever you are, in whatever state of life, whatever moment of life. Consider Thomas a friend and a helper. If you run into difficulties in your life, then you have in a new way a helper in those challenges. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I was asking whether or not his journal that he works with, the Word on Fire Journal for Faith and Culture, is in the library. He's not certain whether it is, but we're going to make sure that it's in there. So that's a commitment I'm making with the Roca Seca Project. We're going to get a subscription, and it's going to be in the library. And so you are all going to be able to go and see it. I want to hold it up because it's a very elegant publication. This one's so elegant that the pages are stuck together, but it got water damage. So, but it's a beautiful, incredible journal with all sorts of different things and perspectives. There's a theme that holds them together. But he might say just a word about that. It's been a really beautiful gift that's come through the Word on Fire initiative of Bishop Robert Barron. Many of you know that he's down in Winona, Rochester. But we're very grateful that Todd Warner answered the call tonight to come and share with us. That's one of his claims to fame, is his work with this journal and the Word on Fire Institute. But he also has a whole lot of other things that he's passionate about. He's passionate about medicine. He's passionate about education. He's passionate about the faith. He's passionate about culture. He's passionate about students. He does have some connections with St. John's, but I think we'll forgive him that tonight. So I don't see any rotten fruit. So let's just allow him to visit, and we'll make our decision afterwards whether it was a good idea to invite him. But I just wanted to thank Dr. Todd Warner for leading us into this topic, Have We Forgotten Who We Are? Resurrecting Catholic Identity in an Uncertain Age. I'm excited about tonight, and I think you should be excited as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd Warner.
Well, I don't know about you, but I think I should have a Father Howe that precedes me everywhere I go, because I would benefit from that. You're a good press man. Thank you. I was hoping you were going to leave that Johnny thing off to the side, but yeah, so please let me get to my car safely, if you guys don't mind. I am an adjunct professor. I'm a doctor. My day job is I'm an internal medicine doctor. I'm an adjunct professor at St. John's, but I have given talks at St. Thomas before, and my best friend almost married my sister. And he was a Tommy. That didn't work out, but that's another story. It's another speech. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. And I would tease by saying the name of the organization that's asking me to come and speak is called Dry Rock, or translated Dry Rock. And they said, who's the best person to speak to the notion of a dry rock than Warner, which might let you know that this, there could be some question as to how engaged you're going to be in this. No, this is a wonderful opportunity and a wonderful reason to get together. It's important, and I want to thank especially the college students that are here. I want to reinforce the notion that for you to have your faith so vibrantly alive in college, for you to recognize the importance not just of education but of formation, for you to recognize that God is not something you table during the years when you are running around with your friends and kind of living the freer life that sometimes comes with college, to say this is a priority, and I'm going to make a prayer life and the sacraments a priority in this time, in these days, and at this college, is a huge, huge testimony to what you are bringing to the earth. So I want to thank you so much for being the ferment that this society needs. And for everybody else who's here, thank you for coming. So as Father said, the title of this talk is Have We Forgotten Who We Are? Resurrecting Catholic Identity in an Uncertain Age. And I don't want this to sound like a strident title. It's not a strident topic. It's a topic that has to do with reclaiming Catholic identity in a world that's sort of lost its way. And especially among those of us who are at times distracted from what really matters. So I'd like to begin the talk by drawing, as I often do, from the ingenious works of G.K. Chesterton. In his landmark work of religious awakening, Orthodoxy, Chesterton made this observation. We have all read in scientific books, and indeed in all romances, the story of the man who has forgotten his name. The man walks about the streets and can see and appreciate everything, only he cannot remember who he is. Well, every man is that man in the story. Every man has forgotten who he is. We are all under the same mental calamity. We have all forgotten our names. We have all forgotten what we really are. Now, Chesterton would further expand on this, reasoning that we have been disarmed. In many cases, we have disarmed ourselves when it comes to embracing who we truly are and the narrative by which we live and by which we die. Chesterton goes on, what we suffer from is humility in the wrong place. Modesty has settled upon the organ of conviction where it was never meant to be. The old humility was a spur that prevented a man from stopping, not a nail in his boot that prevented him from going on. For the old humility made a man doubtful about his efforts, which might make him work harder. But the new humility makes a man doubtful about his aims, which will make him stop working altogether. We are on the road, Chesterton warned, to producing a race of men too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication table. Now, by the way, confronted with the self-satisfied sophistry of a cultural radical asking, who knows that 2 and 2 do not make 5 on the planet Jupiter, Chesterton answered simply, I do. Now, Chesterton wrote all of this over a century ago, and yet it still applies to you and me in this modern age. We all have forgotten who and what we really are. Now, a consequence of this forgetting, this spiritual amnesia, is well described by French Catholic novelist Georges Bernanot in his masterwork, The Diary of a Country Priest. And if you haven't read The Diary of a Country Priest, it's phenomenal. It's dark, it's challenging, but it is transformative as a novel. And here's what he writes in this masterwork. I believe, in fact, I am certain that many men never give out the whole of themselves, their deepest truths. They live on the surface, and yet so rich is the soil of humanity that even this thin outer layer is able to yield a kind of meager harvest, which gives the illusion of real living. I've heard that during the last war, World War I, timid little clerks were turned out to be real leaders. Without knowing it, they had in themselves the passion to command. But how many men will never have the least idea of what is meant by supernatural heroism, without which there can be no inner life? Therefore, when death has bereft them of all the artificial props with which society provides such people, they will find themselves as they really are, as they were without ever knowing it. Horrible, undeveloped monsters, the stumps of men. So what happened? Why have we forgotten who and what we are? Well, first I would argue, and it's kind of an obvious reason, is that we're too distracted. We are over busy and under reflective. We live a frenetic and self-promoting exterior life at the expense of a humble and prayer-filled interior life. Pope Benedict XVI claimed, "We are no longer able to hear God. There are too many frequencies filling our ears." Robert Frost, the ruddy, avuncular New England poet, whom Lionel Trilling called terrifying for his warm, pastoral ways of cleverly shocking us with our true selves, captured our hunger for peace and intentionality amidst the rush and efficiency in his 16-line poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Has anybody ever read Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening here? Okay, I'm seeing, hands. So I'm going to tell you this really quickly, a little sidebar. Miss Duffy was my 4th grade teacher, and Miss Duffy, I loved Miss Duffy. Miss Duffy had this extraordinary shock of gray hair, bright red lipstick. She had a limp from polio, letting you know how old I was when I was in 4th grade. And Miss Duffy was tough, but she was loving, and she had expectations. I just loved her. And then she asked us all to memorize Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, at which we would, 2 weeks down the road, each stand by our little L-shaped desk for 30 seconds and recite it in front of the whole class. And all of a sudden, Miss Duffy was not my idol anymore. She was my tormentor, okay? So Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, is a wonderful poem. Let me see if I remember this. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now those 16 lines, I remember fumbling through those with my dad for 2 weeks, sweating and just making mistakes and being nervous. And then the appointed day came, and I remember heads were bobbing up and down throughout my whole classroom, and it came to me, and I stood up, and I fell into some sort of a fugue, again, sweat trickling down my neck, my hands flexing, and all of a sudden, I think at the end, I sat down, and I realized I must have said it, it was done, and Robert Frost, I will never read you again, because you were my tormentor for the last 2 weeks, and Miss Duffy, you're on notice. But the bottom line is, it wasn't for me until I was in residency, on my 3rd year of residency, on a brutal night of moonlighting, admitting several people who were very, very sick, 4 other people that were stacked up. My 4 pagers on my waistline were going off. I was sitting at the nurse's station waiting for a urologist to call back in the middle of the night, which is always a bad sign. And all of a sudden, this poem invades my consciousness. And what I didn't understand as a 4th grader who thought, what's the big deal about a guy riding into the woods, stopping, and then riding on, I understood as an overworked resident. And the whole notion of what Robert Frost was basically saying was, we need to stop. We need to be here now. And the worst thing we are in the modern world of multitasking and divided attentions is being intentional. We're awful at it. We all spend too much time ruminating on the past. We spend too much time obsessing about the future, but we are terrible about being here now. We're all about becoming and not being. That was a little sidebar. Sorry about that. In holding the reins of his horse, in this poem, on a business trip late at night through the wintry woods, Frost's writer pauses for only a moment, just a moment, to let go of the rumination of the past, the obsession over the future, and instead he chooses to simply and brilliantly be here in the exquisite, life-giving now. By the way, it's so transcendent, that moment, that he can hear the wind, the quiet wind. He can hear snow falling on snow. You ever been to a place so quiet when it's snowing and it sounds like feathers just lilting down on top of the surface of snow? That's a magical moment. And he held those reins and said, the horse is not in control here. Efficiency is not in control here. I am. I'm going to be here now. Yes, we have forgotten who and what we are, in part because we are distracted. But even more, we have lost track of our Catholic narrative. And when we lose track of our narrative, restless souls that we are, we seek to replace it. And oftentimes, sadly, that replacement is with ideology or nihilism. Flannery O'Connor, writing jarring novels with deep and profound Catholic themes in the mid-20th century, admitted, if you live today, you breathe in nihilism. It's the gas you breathe. And if I hadn't the church to fight it with or to tell me the necessity of fighting it, I'd be the stinkingest logical positivist you ever saw right now. Writing for an age and audience that had lost track of its Catholic narrative, Flannery went on to explain, when you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax and use more normal means of talking to it. When you have to assume it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. Is it any wonder that the miracles of Christ or the prophets, John the Baptist or Jeremiah, they were just larger than life because we're stuck half asleep most of the time. God has to shock us. He has to draw large and startling figures. He has to speak loudly to the deaf. So who are we? Who are we? We, all of us in this room and beyond, everyone that walks the face of the earth, we are dignified children of God. We are people of the narrative, not a narrative, the narrative. And what is the narrative? It is a narrative that comports with our divine origins, our fallen nature, and our redemptive possibilities. There is no other narrative than this. Dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. Dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. That's the narrative. You are dignified. You are not valuable in fragments of an identity, but in totality. You are called. You are not called to economic justice or social promotion, but to utter holiness, which is something so much more. You suffer, but you were first suffered for. And you will see and feel grace. And grace is that most exquisite, most delightful, most surprising gift that reveals the face of God in unlikely quarters and at unexpected times. We are people of the narrative. Dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. And if you'll indulge me, let's explore each of these further. So let's start with dignity. In the 1980 film, The Elephant Man, produced and directed by David Lynch, John Merrick, a severely deformed Englishman, afflicted either with Proteus syndrome or neurofibromatosis, finds himself chased down the street into an alley where ruthless gawkers and bullying gentlemen are determined to torment him for his hideousness and his accidental knockdown of a young girl. As a crowd surges towards Merrick, who is pinned against a wall, a voice bellows out from his misshapen head and his contorted body, "I am not an animal. I am a human being." And then he collapses. Now, wanting to protect John Merrick from the savage ringmaster who owned him for his freak show, because this poor man, this is a true story, this poor man was relegated to a circus and was whipped and beaten by a man who just made him part of his freak show. Protecting John Merrick from that life, Dr. Frederick Treves of the London Hospital fought the fear of young nurses and the cold hospital bureaucracy to allow Merrick to live in the hospital indefinitely. At one riveting moment, the hospital's governor thinks Merrick's recitation of the first lines of the 23rd Psalm is little more than a party trick, a parroting of a quick lesson taught by Dr. Treves. But as the disdainful governor leaves, he hears behind him, almost urgently, yelling Merrick's recitation in a loud voice, the remainder of the psalm, which he was never taught, but he had memorized and loved as a young boy. John Merrick was a dignified child of God, and so are you. As I grew up, my dad said to me what I now say to my daughters: I'm proud of what you do, but I love you for who you are. And just think about that for a second. Think about this achievement-oriented society, that your value is based on your resume. There's a great book written actually by David Brooks called The Road to Character, and the opening part of it I give to medical students, but also to some of the Johnnies. And the long and the short of it is it talks about the notion about your resume self and your eulogy self, and how obsessed we've gotten with our resume selves, what we are on paper to sell us, what we have on paper to remind us that we're valuable, as opposed to the eulogy self, where people say less about what you did professionally or what awards you earned. But at the moment or in the wake of your death, we talk about what you meant to people, the kind of person you were, the kind of parent you were, friend you were, sibling. We should strive more for our eulogy self than we should strive for our resume self. You and I are not valuable in part, but in whole. We're not to be reduced or fragmented to our component parts. We're not valuable simply because of our height or weight, our hair or lack, our race or gender, our pedigree or net worth. We are valuable simply because, in our totality, we are children of God. The psalmist reminds us, you formed my inmost being. You knit me in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My very self you know. Isaiah asks in God's voice, can a mother forget her infant? Be without tenderness for the child of her womb? Even though she forgets, I will never forget. See, upon the palms of my hands, I have engraved you. And of course, Christ, through his parables, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, reminds you that what you have too often forgotten. You are a dignified child of God. You matter. You cannot be thrown away. As his life would draw to a close at a younger age, John Merrick, the Elephant Man, would finish his letters with lines from English Congregationalist minister Isaac Watts. And here's what he'd say: "'Tis true my form is something odd, but blaming me is blaming God. Could I create myself anew, I would not fail in pleasing you. If I could reach from pole to pole or grasp the ocean with a span, I would be measured by the soul. The mind's the standard of the man." We are dignified children of God. We are measured by the soul. We matter because we are. The narrative that we follow tells us that we have dignity. Next, calling. The narrative tells us that we are called. We all sense that our life has some purpose, and we are called to fulfill it. And some have discerned that what that purpose is, some are on the search, and others have a vague uneasiness that there is a dissonance between where they are and where they are called to be. Just, again, a sidebar. If you get a chance to read Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, he explores the notion of the search. And he says the search is to be onto something, to know, and he discovered it when he got shot in the Korean War, this character, and he's lying next to a dung beetle climbing around, and he's looking awkwardly at a tree and the earth, and all of a sudden it dawned on him that there's something more in this awful situation. There's something more out there than just the existence I've been living. He said that's when the search began. But why is it that so many people are out there sleepwalking that aren't on the search? And he calls it, they're trapped in everydayness. They're trapped in everydayness. That the commonality of our existence sometimes bores us. And we forget to ask the questions. We forget to be challenged. We forget to open ourselves to the graces of God. We forget about our identity, our dignified status as children of God. Each calling is profoundly unique and exquisitely personalized, and it unfolds in the context in which you live, the strengths and weaknesses you have, the sound passions by which you are stirred, and the local and cosmic need you are meant to fulfill. But calling begins with humility and openness to God. It begins with awareness, the need to be alert, and an immersion in the interior life of prayer and the sacraments. Part of St. Augustine's restless heart, where he said, "My soul is restless until it rests in thee," is a restlessness not only to recline in God, but to serve God. Too often we ignore or fail to hear God's calling, and instead allow our appetites to direct us. This warped calling leads us down the dark and empty road of the false gods of power, honor, pleasure, and wealth. Power, honor, pleasure, and wealth. The gateway drugs that kind of give you that hit, that buzz, until the buzz wears off and you need more. Power, honor, pleasure, and wealth. But we must not answer that call to the abyss. God's calling to our small, stubborn, and wayward minds often doesn't make sense. C.S. Lewis captured this brilliantly when he said, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he is doing. He is getting the drains right, he's stopping the leaks in the roof, and so on. You know that those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage. But he's building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself. Every life in the Bible, every prophet and saint is suffused with calling. And as you recall, whether it is David or Moses, Mary or Joseph, Peter or Paul, the call is often confusing and frightening, uncomfortable and challenging. But ultimately, it is brilliant, transcendent, and simply right. It is, in two words, of God. By the way, the people that think that the Bible is a fairy tale or faith is a fairy tale, I don't know what book they're reading. It's terrifying sometimes. And it's glorious at others. It is the most sweeping drama imaginable. But it's anything but a fairy tale. It's anything but a soothing, comforting, the end. Right? Though a bit trite, I have found the two statements about calling undeniably true. God does write straight with crooked lines. And faith does mean believing in advance what only makes sense in reverse. You ever had something happen to you, you're like, I can't understand why this is happening. And then 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, you look back and say, I think I sort of do. Let's see how I was changed or formed by this. God writes straight with crooked lines. We're going in a direction, but sometimes it's like, God, where are you going with this? I don't get it. And faith means believing in advance what only makes sense in reverse. The distinguished poet Paul Mariani reminds us of the journey of St. Alphonsus Rodriguez. Sensing, and this was 400 years ago, now 500 years ago, sensing that he was meant to be a Jesuit priest, Rodriguez's plan was derailed by the death of his father and his need to take over his father's clothing business. He would soon marry and have 3 children, but tragedy would strike and he would lose his wife, all his children, and ultimately his business. It's a true Job-like tale. At 35, he would return to the Jesuits only to be told that he was too old to begin instruction, and would have to settle with being a Jesuit brother who would serve as porter, humbly answering the door to welcome guests to the Jesuit house of studies in Mallorca. Now, St. Alphonsus Rodriguez did his work with faith and earnest love, saying each time he answered the door, I'm coming, Lord. Through constant prayer and reading, he became a brilliant and unexpected spiritual director, ultimately forming the young Peter Claver, who would go on to work with thousands of West African slaves in Colombia and converted hundreds of thousands of souls to Christ. Some say the greatest converting priest and saint in history, outside of Christ himself was not a priest. But Gerard Manley Hopkins penned a poem honoring St. Alphonsus Rodriguez, saying, and I'm going to, it's 6 lines, but Yet God, because Hopkins can be hard to understand sometimes, but yet God, who hews mountains and continents, earth all out, who with trickling increment veins violet and tall trees makes more and more. So God who creates mountains and rivers and incredible creation. God could crowd career with conquest. All these people living these wildly extraordinary lives. While there went those years and years by of world without event, that in Mallorca, Alfonso watched the door. And this little man with big dreams and tremendous tragedy would make extraordinary differences to priests and saints on a route he never designed, but God did. And it was St. Alphonsus Rodriguez saying, I'm coming, Lord. And that's how it happened. God has created me, St. John Henry Newman recognized, to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me, which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may not know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. And he'd go on to say, therefore, I will trust him. Whatever I am, I can never be thrown away. To borrow again from G.K. Chesterton, through our calling, God catches us with an unseen hook, an invisible line which is long enough to let us wander to the ends of the world and still to bring us back with a twitch upon the thread. The narrative tells us that we are called. So we talked about dignity, calling, suffering. The narrative reminds us that we will suffer. Suffering has been part of our narrative from our very beginnings, starting with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden and continuing with Cain's murdering of Abel. Suffering has been inextricably, maddeningly woven into the fabric of the human story. But we've always struggled with why. Gordon Allport, in his preface before Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, described the central themes of existentialism by saying, to live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering. And in the twilight of the idols of all people, Friedrich Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. But the how of life, as we know, can at times be brutal. Consider how mankind's rich literary tradition has grappled with suffering from our beginnings. And again, I give a rotation called The Wisdom of Literature in a Time of Plague. I've been giving it for 3 years. When COVID hit, medical students were displaced from the rotations, and I got a grant, and I was teaching on King Lear and the plague, Camus' The Plague, and I still do. And it's amazing how much we can encounter great literature that is 1,000 years old, 500 years old, 100 years old, but it's as fresh today as it was when it first hit the printing press or the parchment paper, because it's talking about the universals of what it means to be human. And suffering is a dominant theme in literature. Dominant. And why is that? Because we want to share our story. And I don't know about you guys, but when I read great literature or I watch films, I want to learn how to do this better. I want someone to show me the escape hatch. How do I get through this? I'm taking notes from Anna Karenina. I'm taking notes from King Lear when he ever got something right, which wasn't very often. Think about the rich literary tradition that has grappled with suffering from our beginnings. Prometheus, bound to a rock for stealing fire from the gods, and visited daily by an eagle who inch by gory inch consumes the Titan's liver, only to regenerate and go through the torture all over again the next day. Right? It's bad enough that an eagle is going to eat your liver, but then you wake up the next day and your liver's grown back, and here comes the eagle again. And that god in the Greek days, when you were hated, you were really hated, right? Creon, rigidly and haughtily punishing Antigone only to lose his own son and wife to ghastly suicide in a twist of fate that he couldn't even anticipate. Agamemnon, I'm not trying to stick with all the Greek, we're not going to make our ways all the way from the Greeks all the way to modern literature, but I know we have a time limit here. Agamemnon, trudging home from 10 years' war that began with his murderous sacrifice of his own daughter, only to be slain in the bathtub by his own wife. Hamlet lamenting his lost father. Raskolnikov pursued by paranoia and guilt. Elizabeth Bennet castigated by her social superior. And Scrooge haunted by a beckoning grave. The poems O Captain, My Captain, or funeral blues, for whom the bell tolls, and spring and fall, all remind us of the transience of life and the inevitability of death, and nagging us with a dark assertion by philosopher Thomas Hobbes that perhaps life is only, in fact, nasty, brutish, and short. In Job's senseless sufferings, or seemingly senseless sufferings, we sympathize as he demands an audience from a just God. While in Christ's culminating passion, we too ask, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What people don't realize, Flannery O'Connor wrote, is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big electric blanket, when of course it is the cross. To be sure, the meaning behind suffering will remain a galling mystery, at least until we encounter God face to face. But God does offer us glimmers of insight. When God deigns to answer Job's impassioned questions about his suffering, he answers with a hailstorm of questions. "Where were you at the creation of the universe?" God asks. "Where were you when I put the Leviathan in the deep, or put the stars into the sky? Were you there, Job? Were you there? Were you there?" And in humbling Job, God says, in effect, that if Job so little understands the divine operations of the physical universe, how much less does he comprehend God's management of the moral universe? Have faith, he infers. Have faith. As Jesus is about to heal the blind man, and questions ensue as to why this man has suffered such an affliction, Jesus corrects the disciples' pet theories about sin and suffering, saying his blindness is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. And again, prior to the raising of Lazarus, Jesus said, "This illness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified through it." And arriving late to heal him, Jesus said, "Lazarus has died, and I'm glad for you that I was not there." Think about that. Jesus saying, "I'm glad I was not, your brother died. I was glad I was not there to save him." But he says, I'm glad for you that I was not there, that you may believe. Let us go to him. In that moment when he says, they're like, "What? What do you mean?" He says, "There's a bigger ending to this story that you don't understand, and I'm about to show it to you." Suffering is inevitable in one form or another, to one degree or another. But suffering is not the enemy. Losing our faith in the midst of suffering is. Hans Urs von Balthasar once noted, "When one surveys, even from a distance, how often and openly sacred scripture speaks of fear and anxiety, an initial conclusion presents itself. The Word of God is not afraid of fear or anxiety. Wherever we suffer, God is there, suffering with us." The narrative tells us that we will suffer. So dignity, calling, suffering, grace. The narrative comforts us that we will receive grace. And what is perhaps the greatest tragedy ever written, Shakespeare's King Lear, the king, thanks to his arrogance and impulsiveness, hands his kingdom over to his two wicked daughters and their spouses, while banishing his one true and faithful daughter, Cordelia. Now, before long, emasculated and humiliated, Lear finds himself in a field, half naked, half crazed, cursing God amidst an unrelenting thunderstorm. It is said that Lear devolves from this this majestic figure to this broken, crazy, screeching man in a storm. They say the thunderstorm in King Lear is the hardest, most dramatic scene in all playcraft to reproduce on a stage. Imagine a thunderstorm and a crazy man screaming at God for quite some time. Okay, it's really good to see. So I mean, I know you're like, I don't think I want to do that on Friday night. It's worth it. Okay, it's worth it. His daughters Goneril and Regan, who he's given the kingdom to, are hurting him with plans to kill him, or hunting him with plans to kill him, as he's a threat to their growing power. Lear, in the midst of this harangue against God and injustice and his daughters and so on and so forth, collapses. But when he awakens, he is safe for a moment in the care of the French army. His daughter, Cordelia, now the Queen of France, when she got banished, she kind of landed on her feet, apparently. She married the King of France. Now the Queen of France kneels beside him. And here's what happens. Cordelia has been totally spurned by her dad, humiliated in front of friends and family, and banished with no prospects, no dowry, and yes, she marries the King of France. But her dad was incredibly ruthless to her. And she has basically gone and she's heard what's happened to her father, what's happened to the kingdom under her two sisters who were trying to take over and kill their father. And she comes over and starts fighting back, and there she is face to face with the guy who was a total jerk to her. Face to face with this guy. And what happens? She says, "Oh, look upon me, sir," as he starts, his lids start fluttering and he's waking up. She says, "Oh, look upon me, sir, and hold your hand in benediction over me." She wants his blessing. And he starts getting out of his chair and starts to kneel because he recognizes the color. She's the queen, and he's nobody in his eyes right now. She says, "You must not kneel." And Lear says, "Pray, do not mock me. I'm a very foolish old man, 80 and upward, not an hour more nor less. And to deal plainly, I fear I am not in my perfect mind. I think I should know you and know this man who's with her, yet I am doubtful, for I'm mainly ignorant what place this is, and all the skill I have remembers not these garments, nor I know not where I did lodge last night." Total confusion. "Do not laugh at me, for as I am a man, I think this lady to be my child Cordelia." And she starts to cry, and she says, "So I am. And he says, "Be your tears wet? Yes, faith, I pray, weep not. If you have poison for me, I will drink it. I know you do not love me. For your sisters have, as I do remember, done me wrong. You have some cause not to love me. They have not." And Cordelia says, "No cause. No cause." And in that moment of profound forgiveness, the entire play changes. And Lear, who is a selfish, complaining, chest-throwing, just a jerk, is transformed. And it's not because he's a king, and it's not because he's wealthy and is going to live in pleasure in the Queen's palace over in France. It's because his daughter reminded him that he's valuable because he simply exists, because he's her father. It's a moment of supreme grace, of unmerited forgiveness. And Lear, even when fate ultimately, it's a tragedy, guys. So just get ready. It all ends very badly, okay? But this is a bright, penetrating light of grace that everybody kind of misses in King Lear, because he's different, totally different, in spite of what happened to him and what awaits him. So when fate ultimately conspires against him, he's forever changed. Grace is the most enduring. When fate ultimately conspires against him and conquers him, he is still forever changed by grace thereafter. Grace is the most enduring and most overlooked aspect of the narrative. We are all too obsessed with our callings. We are all so uncertain of our dignity, and we're all definitely worried about suffering or lost in our suffering, that grace walks past our eyes all the time. All the time. Preoccupied with our identity, searching for our purpose, worried about our suffering, we sleepwalk past grace all the time. Just consider the countless graces dispensed by our God. Blind men made to see, mute men speaking, a stooped woman standing upright, leprous men cleansed. And our God starts from a place of yes, not a place of no. Our God starts from a place of yes. Be clean. Your sins are forgiven. Rise up and walk. Be at peace. And at the pinnacle moment of grace in all of world history, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You ever stop for a second and say, why couldn't our God have been just a mean, angry, vindictive, Greek-style God, playing with us and so on? And yet this is just oceans of grace washing over, washing over, washing over. Imagine the shame of St. Peter, the rock, betraying Christ not once but 3 times, and then feeling that shame vanish when Christ asks him 3 times, "Do you love me more than these?" And telling him 3 times, "Either feed my sheep or feed my lambs." Peter believed in, supported, loved by the very God he hanged. Imagine the fear disappearing from the woman caught in the act of adultery and about to be stoned. Is there no one here to condemn you? Then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And she walks away relieved and reborn. And imagine the peaceful resolve of St. Paul, who in spite of prayers to be freed of the thorn in his flesh, is comforted by the assurance that God's grace is sufficient. And don't forget these grace-filled assurances. When St. Paul insisted, I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor present things, nor future things, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Or when Jesus promised, and behold, I am with you always until the end of the age. In the final pages of George Bernano's gripping novel, which I commend to you again, Diary of a Country Priest, the long-suffering priest who has served as an agent of grace for so many slips into death, but not before uttering the greatest truth. Grace is everywhere. Everywhere. The narrative comforts us that we will receive grace. So in conclusion, indeed at times it seems like we have forgotten who we are. We are distracted and we've just lost track of the narrative. But let me remind you, we are Catholics. We are people of the narrative of dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. And we are all called to live it vibrantly. But to live that narrative, we must remember the narrative. We were not made for comfort. We were made for greatness. So now at St. Thomas and beyond, let your brilliant light shine and never extinguish. Thank you.
All glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I forgot the prayer at the beginning, so we prayed and we'll pray at the end, don't worry. It's a great evening, some wonderful insights, and a great arc to be on with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Warner, for those comments. We are recording tonight, by the way, so if you have friends that might be edified by those words, they'll be available, I believe, through the St. Thomas YouTube. We are going to make sure that that recording is linked on our website, but we are going to continue the evening with some questions. So Matt Slattery is in the center aisle. If anyone has a question to address to Dr. Warner, I invite you just to rise and maybe a quick introduction of yourself in terms of your name, if you're a student or if you're a friend, and then launch into questions. But we're happy to have about a half hour of time just to go a little deeper into this beautiful and rich content in this Easter season.
And if I've answered everything, that's great.
I just maybe begin with a question. I loved the breadth of your references. In fact, I was actually excited when you started going through the classical mythology. It was kind of bringing me back to my days of classic studies. One of my favorite classes on campus was the classical hero and modern and contemporary film. And it was just a great kind of coming together of those two worlds. But would you say that you, in terms of literature especially and poetry, do you find that you keep going back and back and back to the same works, or are you venturing forward into the canon of Western literature and maybe even Eastern literature? Do you find that you're kind of going deeper into the tradition in an ongoing way? Maybe how do you find time to do that?
God rest Miss Duffy's soul. I really feel bad because I should have reached out. She died in 2017. And this is in Little Jefferson Elementary School in Mason City, Iowa. And I think she was an unmarried, I would almost say, I know she was Catholic, and there might have been a devotion to the faith in her unmarried status. I wish I would have reached back to her to say that poem was transformative to me. Let me say this quickly. Going into medicine, I had no doctors in my family. I had no idea what I was doing. And it's a great field, but I had no clue. I didn't even know my family practice doctor. And so I had a lot of figuring out things to do about how to get into medical school. And so I thought, in order to get into medical school, I just had to take all these science classes. I converted my humanities classes. I was taking the death and dying, sociology of death and dying. I mean, it was good stuff, but I totally bypassed great works, literature and historical classes and so on. And I would honestly say it's been the last 15 years of my life that I actually started reading this stuff. And all I can say is, and I'm not trying to keep hammering this narrative, the dignity, calling, suffering, grace, but I would say that narrative is so present in so many works of literature that I just can't shake it. It's in Dostoevsky, it's in Tolstoy, it's in Jane Austen, it's in Dante, it's in Bernanke, it's in Flannery O'Connor, it's in Evelyn Waugh. It's over and over and over again. And to your question, I cannot get enough reading the new stuff. I always say, if you're going to read something, the first time you read it, you kind of understand what happened. But every time you reread it thereafter, if it's worth it, you're going deeper into what it means. So I read right now, I'm not an existentialist, to be sure, but I read Camus' The Plague for this medical school rotation, and the bottom line is, I mean, I hate to say it, but Camus, he was an atheist, but he's totally God-haunted. He's totally God-haunted. And if you read The Plague, you're like, dude, you are talking about, this is God stuff, and yet you're kind of proud, and you're friends with Sartre, and you're like, you're going to stay above the fray. I'm like, you are just being fundamentally dishonest with yourself. Just go for it. Go for it. And I'm not trying to project, but I am. Great literature, enduring literature, yes, ancient, and there's some good modern stuff too. But I hate to say it, the ancient stuff or the classic stuff doesn't get the play it deserves. And so I would challenge you, yes, read, whatever you do, read. But dive into those works that you think, it's over my head. You can handle anything. You can read Moby Dick. You can read Anna Karenina. You can read War and Peace. You can read Shakespeare. Get this book, the Ignatius Press. They literally have bubbles by words you don't know. And it takes you 1 second to go, I don't know all this stuff. And yet when you read it, the imaginative notion of literature will bring your faith to life. As Russell Kirk would say, the moral imagination. When Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, that's amazing. But when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, it transfixes you. Because here's a story. And so that's why I think all of us can sit in a great homily, but when our priests tell a story, we're like, now you're talking. Now I'm in. You got the hook in my mouth. So read great literature, even that which challenges you, even that which challenges sometimes your worldview. The Plague challenges my worldview, and I kind of stick it right back to Camus. But the long and the short of it is, those narratives are wonderful parables and imaginative ways to witness to our deep and profound Catholic faith.
Thank you. Matthew Michaels, alumni of the University 2017. Just to piggyback off of some of your comments about the creative imagination within literature and inspired by your references that I really appreciated to sort of Lynchian filmography, I also wonder where within a sort of cinematic experience can we also find a lot of the similar formation about who we are and identity that we find in some of these, ancient, classics and, modern classics as well. I'm thinking specifically of so much of, out of all the places that it could be, Westerns, especially like the classic age, the golden age of Westerns, pre-spaghetti Western, just finding so much in there, from The Searchers to Stagecoach to Red River, about what it means to be who we are, and even seeing a parallel between King Lear and the John Wayne's character in Red River. Separate topic for later. But I guess my question is, where within the cinematic world can we find the same kind of impact that we can have from literature, and if that is even possible?
Oh, it's a great question. And I wish I were more of a cinematic expert. I will tell you, one of our great, at Word on Fire, one of the great kind of experts in film and cinema is Andrew Petiprin. He's just recently has stepped away from Word on Fire. I can tell you, if I may, the narrative I was kind of highlighting in this talk, it is so present in those films. And again, I think new films have it too. I mean, there's strong narratives that are carried forth in Harry Potter and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, and and even the Avengers series. I mean, to be honest with you. But I oftentimes am saying go back. I would say go back to again, a lot of classic movies that are oftentimes very well done. They're actually given for a more mature audience. I think nowadays they spoon feed us so much, and it's like, you don't use your imagination. We're going to make it real for you, so you don't have to think at all. The storylines, even, I tell you what, even those who do not have a fondness for Catholicism cannot get away from the notion that their viewers who may not have a fondness for Catholicism do have a fondness for the notion that somebody is valuable and somebody loses track of their value and somebody wants to restore their value or rediscover their value. They need to still grapple with the notion of suffering because, again, people suffer. People want to watch other people suffer, not in a macabre way, but I still think it's a little bit of they've gone through some tough stuff too. It's this sort of commiserating with your character. How do they get out of it? And they want to see resolutions. They want to see resolutions. People don't like things that just end badly. I mean, I know there's the dark ones that just end badly. You're like, oh, that just made me so much more sophisticated. But it's sort of like, I don't know. I mean, the world's tough as it is. I mean, I had kids. I'm like, I don't want to watch those dark movies anymore. Life is hard, you know? So I just think, film is another modality that is explosive with this narrative of dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. And the bottom line is, the Catholics had it first. It's our narrative. It's everyone's narrative. It's sort of like, great, you're totally milking it. Just go the next step and just say, yeah, and Jesus Christ figures in this too, you know? So, great question. I wish I could give you a movie list. Believe me, if we had a few more, 10 more minutes, I'd start listing them off. But your question is absolutely appropriate. Film is a wonderful place to find stories and narratives that will echo the narrative. And we should be watching those when you don't have time to read War and Peace. But then find time to read War and Peace. Ron, if you ask me anything about Newman, I'm going to defer to you.
No, I appreciate you mentioning him, though. But Ron Snyder, 2013 Catholic Studies graduate. I wanted to compliment you, Dr. Warner, as a fan of your journal, managing editor, correct?
Yeah.
The narrative that you spoke of runs throughout that journal.
Thank you.
I mean, it touches so many different parts of our culture. Are you the genius behind the journal, or a part of it? Or is it all you? Are you on the same
Ron,
page?
can we just hang out a little bit?
Yeah. No, but it's very consistent with the journal, which is absolutely beautiful.
Well, thank you. And again, I owe you $20 for that shameless plug. Again, it's available near you. No, I would say, if I may say this without false modesty, it's the Catholic narrative. It's the Catholic narrative, and I will say one of the things I think, if I can just talk about the journal for a second, we were given wide berth to make something. My line is, we want to make the most beautiful, most substantive Catholic journal that's ever been made, ever in print. And I'm biased. I think we did. I'm biased by saying that. But it's only because we are tapping into the gifts of our designers who exude beauty and visions of beauty that are rooted in their deep faith in God. And we have writers that want to explore every avenue that shines a light on the upside and downside, the ins and outs of what it means to be a Catholic in the modern world, and always lands on the incredible graces of God. And so the creation of it was a joy. The opportunity to continue it is a joy. Many hands make light work. Many visions came together. But at the center of it all is the Holy Spirit, and is the fact that it's the Catholic narrative. And when you have the Catholic narrative, you get out of the Spirit's way and you let it shine. So thank you for your kind words. I appreciate
that. Thank you. My name is Julia. I'm a senior about to graduate in a month.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I just had a question about how we bring this narrative to other people. I think it's great for us to tap into the beautiful tradition of the church and the great literary tradition of the West, but even as we do that, we'll be surrounded by others who haven't. And so I guess my question is just, how do we bring that to them even though they might not be participating in reading the great works of the church or the great literary tradition?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a fundamental question of evangelization you're asking, which is great. We had a young relative who we saw over a holiday at one point or the other, and he'd been reading Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, all the new atheists and so on, right? And he was kind of, full of vim and vigor and gonna kind of tell us kind of what's what and all this kind of stuff. And it just so happens years and years ago, this narrative, I'm not trying to sound like a broken record, it's been percolating in my mind for years. And to kind of engage him, I just kind of said, I just want to ask you just a couple of fundamental questions. I'm not going to ask you, do you believe in the divinity of Christ? But I want to start with, do you believe that your life has value? Yeah. I mean, that you want to be recognized for being valuable in one form, one fashion or the other, but that you intrinsically matter. Yeah, I do. Okay. Do you feel like your life has purpose? Do you feel like there's a direction? Are you hunting or working for something that surrounds a purpose that's very, very naturally tied to you, very personal? Yeah, I do. He's rolling his eyes by this time. Have you suffered? And he's a young, he was a teenager at the time, but he went through this kind of, I think, fibular dysplasia issue where he had to have all these surgeries where they had to break his bone and then kind of put bolts in it and have a halo for a number of times in his childhood. It was terrible. So he knew suffering. Then I said, have you ever been visited by something that helped when you didn't expect it, when you didn't deserve it, but there it was? I said, yeah. I said, however you feel at this stage in your life about the divinity of Christ and how you're operating with this, those four pillars, dignity, calling, suffering, and grace, that's the architecture of faith. And you believe in it. And I said, Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris, they're going to take pot shots at all these things, flying spaghetti monsters and all that kind of stuff, just kind of sad arguments against God. But the true fundamental walk you are leading day in and day out of those four things I said, that's as personal, that's as engrafted in your marrow as anything comes. And I said, and that is our faith. That is our faith. And now the nuances of the prophecies towards Christ's simultaneous act of justice and mercy in his crucifixion, and so on and so on and so forth. There's more work to be done. But it's interesting. It's sort of like, Bishop Barron's notion is, we need to lead with beauty. The truth, goodness, and beauty. Because if you do lead with beauty, it's hard to argue this is beautiful, that is beautiful, and so on. Unless somebody's being a contrarian. The Sistine Chapel is amazing. And if you recognize that something is beautiful, then you're saying that there is something good within that beauty. And if you're saying that something is good, then you're saying there must be some sort of truth behind that. And if you're really starting to get into truth, then God, you are starting to walk into the playground of God. And I know it's not as satisfying because we think, can't we just sit across from somebody, have a beer, and start with them being an atheist and then becoming a Catholic at the end of the conversation? I think when we get too impatient to make that happen, it sometimes backfires. And I'm not saying there aren't Saul being knocked off the horse conversions. There's a billion and one ways it happens. But I think if we start by talking to people about that common narrative that no one else is talking about, that is deeply intrinsically ours, and we walk with them. Thomas Aquinas, I think it might be apocryphal. Maybe he said it. But he says, if you want to convert somebody, take them by the hand and lead them. It's intentional. It's invested. It's engaged. It isn't like I got a 5-minute conversation where I evangelized and I walked up and thumped my chest, and this person's like, I'm farther away from God than when you began. It is the work of God through us over time. So I don't know if it's never going to be a fully satisfying answer, but I do want to say there are so many experiences, natural experiences as human beings that we can reflect with people and say, this is the faith. This is our faith. And it all emanates from Christ. And if you'll indulge me, let's keep talking. Does that make sense?
Hi, yeah, Thomas Kula, senior undergraduate here as well. My question, I guess, kind of goes towards the narrative part of suffering, and there's some natural suffering, but there's also a lot of suffering in the world born from like the evil that like we keep in, I guess, our human hearts, and that we all have to kind of contend with on a daily basis. And then just from a person you used in a quote earlier, like how would the Christian view or the Catholic view of that kind of counter to like Nietzsche would say, you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss stares back at you, and kind of like, you go until you meet the suffering of the world, and like they would say that maybe that would just, lead to more suffering for yourself. How does the redemptive side of maybe the Catholic view counter that, and how the suffering then can lead to redemption and grace?
So let me see if I'm getting your question right. So kind of how does...
So I guess when you're told to confront the suffering in the world, and like there is natural suffering, but there's also suffering caused by evil, and you have to, at what point, and so I guess how I read Nietzsche saying that is, you look into that evil and you try to confront that evil long enough that you'll see that in yourself, and maybe, get discouraged by it. And so that side of things.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Parallel. This is I'm actually. It's a great question. So I've been practicing medicine. I'm going to give you a medical answer. That's not a dodge, but I hope it's a parallel. So I had a patient who had a daughter who was just a very bad person, very abusive to her. She's a widow. This patient of mine is a widow. And her daughter got into meth and got into all sorts of bad actors and so on, and was constantly stealing from her mom, or was kind of just manipulating her. And I'm listening to the stories that this woman is telling me, and I said, "You've got to get out of that relationship." And she said, "I can't." She goes, "I can't get out of that relationship. That's my daughter." I said, "You got to find a way to protect yourself." I mean, I was like, just cut her off. This is terrible. Cut her off. Now, I didn't have kids at that time. You know what's coming, right? Two things. Years pass. I thought this woman was beyond. I thought this daughter was beyond hope and was just malevolent in this poor, lovely, lovely woman's life. And I just said, just cut her off. Merciless. Just cut her off because she's done so much bad. Who could argue with that? Well, years later, and I've been seeing this woman over time, I have my kids, 2 daughters, that I would walk in front of a car for every moment of every day, how much I love them. And I came to realize I gave her bad advice. Now, there's the notion of, yes, there needs to be corrections and there needs to be limits and so on and so on and so forth. But to kind of expect her ever to not love her daughter, ever to not fully ache, ever to fully be able to just disown and never look back and say good riddance, that was the perspective of an untutored person in parenting. That when I became a parent, I looked at it completely differently. Anyone know something? They reconciled. And now her daughter's been clean and sober for 5 years, lives with her mom, is an extraordinary daughter, comes to her doctor's visits. And if she would have taken my advice, that wouldn't have happened at all. And so what am I trying to say in answer to your question? Sometimes the experience of our brokenness and the experience of our inhumanity, the things that kind of stain us and pockmark us and so on, hopefully they give us humility so that we better understand somebody else. And hopefully they also give us a little bit of wisdom and charity so that when we see other people's sufferings, we're not about the task of fixing it and then dusting our hands off. We're in the task of accompaniment and walking with them and being willing to suffer along with them. Because at the end of the day, it isn't about avoiding suffering at all costs. It is about doing God's work in the midst of suffering and not failing to. Does that mean that saints didn't get tired and grumble and argue and all that kind of stuff? Of course they did. Of course they did. But they had endless hope that outlasted the abyss. And the only thing with Nietzsche, the only problem is that he just didn't realize the abyss isn't the biggest thing. God is. He outlives the abyss. So with our own brokenness humbling us, with our own brokenness giving us wisdom, and with the strength of God hoisting us into a position to make a difference with other people, even if it means it hurts over and over and over again, in the end, it will be okay. It doesn't mean we'll solve all the world's problems, but in the end, in the afterlife, in the reconciliation of all things, it will be okay. We just can't grow faint of heart. We are the light. If we go out, where is it? So it's our job in the midst of the wind blowing and the snuffing attempts and so on to keep that light burning. Is that an okay attempt at answering your question? Great. By the way, you probably come to realize I answer in like paragraphs, long paragraphs. My wife's sitting here and she's looking at me like this sometimes. I'm like, okay, I'll curb it.
I like long paragraph answers. So
Oh, you'll get them.
Yeah. I'm Peter, also a senior. I guess there's a lot of us here.
Congratulations, all you seniors. You're going out into the world to bring the good news.
Well, it's a frightening prospect. And so, I don't know, as I sit here thinking about how I'm going to be going into the world in a month or so, I was wondering, how do you find these 4 pillars in your working life, and how does it, I don't know, strengthen or empower or otherwise make your working life more tolerable or meaningful, or
That's a great
what have
question.
you?
I see it everywhere, as you might imagine. I see it everywhere. I see it everywhere. And I say to my medical students, sometimes you're going to walk into a room and you're going to ask somebody how they're doing, and that's the first time, if you do it right, if you care, and you listen, that's the first time someone's asked them anything about themselves and cared to listen for an answer in a month. And it's sort of, I think Mother Teresa once said, or St. Teresa of Calcutta once said, I don't know if it was the greatest illness in the world is not tuberculosis or what have you, it's loneliness. We have a world that's profoundly lonely. And it's made worse by, yes, all the fighting and all this kind of stuff, but it's the notion that we're at odds with each other, that we're not in community with each other. That we are achievement-oriented, that it's a values-based, utilitarian, efficient society. And that's why our faith says, no. It's not quantitative. This is not a quantitative thing. It's about the profound, inextricably bound value of who you are as a person. And so in answer to your question, in a way, I see people struggling with their own value, with understanding who they are, where they are in their families. I see King Lear every week. The CEO who committed their life to a business, and their family kind of grew, still married, kids are doing great, all went to great schools and all this kind of stuff, but the family kind of grew without him. And then he was struggling to kind of reclaim that. And he retires and he goes home, and his spouse is off doing other things. His kids are too busy with lacrosse halfway across the country. And then goes back to work to try to sink his feet into, let me be an advisor, let me help. They're all like, no, you retired to get away from this, go home. And he comes and sees me, he's totally depressed. He's got tons of money, tons of status, he's respected. He doesn't know who he is. He forgot who he was, forgot his value that was outside his resume and so on. So I just think, and again, I'm not trying to put a trademark on this narrative, but I'm just saying you will see the narrative in full in the lives of people you love. You will see it in the books you read. You will see it in the people you're helping in your work. And the issue, I think to some extent, the issue you sometimes have to ask yourself, which part of this narrative is playing the biggest role in this person's life as they're sitting in front of me right now? Is this a person in need of grace? Is this a person who's wrapped up in their suffering? Is this a person uncertain of their dignity? Is this a person discerning their calling? And then what about you? Where are you in that journey? And by the way, it's a cycling journey over and over again. These strains are with us all the time, those 4. And I think the point is, I think if you're looking for it, you will find humanity in front of you, desperately looking for love over and over again. And Bernano, again, great book, Bernano talks about being an agent of grace. Isn't that a wonderful thing? You graduate this year, your remaining days in St. Thomas, and all the days ahead of you, you get to be an agent of grace, a conduit of God's grace in ways big and small, in ways that will surprise you even, because the opportunity to be an agent of grace happened just right that second with that person, and you hit a home run without even knowing it. So I would say keeping that narrative front and center as you engage with your reading, as you engage with your film watching, as you engage with your family, you engage with your friends, you engage with your enemies, you engage with yourself, it will turn your perspective on life on its head and make you more centered on the Catholic call to do Christ's work in a hungry, hungry world. Make sense?
Just one final question.
Hi, my name's Katie. I didn't go to St. Thomas, but I've worked.
St. John's? St. Ben's?
No.
Okay.
I'm from Florida, actually. I've just worked here at St. Thomas the last 4 years with St. Paul's Outreach, so
great.
campus ministry. Kind of a simple question. I just was wondering, I feel very inspired to read and dive more into reading and literature in my life after hearing you speak, and I'm just wondering if you would recommend any reading for young people, like college age people, that would maybe inspire them, to respond to the call of greater truth in their life, what that would be.
Terrific. Do you want 20 or 30 options? No, I'm teasing. I got them for you. I want to make sure. I want to make sure as I talk about a lot of. There's amazing Catholic works to read. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, Flannery O'Connor's Habit of Being. And by the way, I can send an email to Father, and I'll send this all out. Dante's Divine Comedy, the Moviegoer from Walker Percy, Sigurd Undset's Christian Lavransdatter, anything written by George Bernanno. And then there's Charles Pagoy, the poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins, Graham Greene, the power. I think it's The Power and the Glory, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Yeah. So there's a ton of kind of literature that falls under a Catholic bent, and then the other side, which I think has Catholic sensibilities, and I'd say echoes of God in a secular world, right? Moby Dick, anything from Shakespeare, anything from Jane Austen, Charles Dickens. Look, Scrooge. What a story of redemption. What a story of dignity. What a story of suffering, right? All the players are right there. Let's see. Dickens, Austen, Shakespeare, Melville. Gosh, I have so many now. I'm just the Greek tragedies. Here's the thing. I tease my students. I said, how many of you read Hamlet? Okay, when did you read Hamlet? 9th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. I say, you never read Hamlet, right? I'm teasing. But the point is, I read Hamlet in 9th grade. I took the test. I went to see it at the Guthrie. I got an A. No idea what happened in Hamlet. I had no clue. I don't know, there's a ghost, and there's a guy with a skull, and everybody dies. And that's kind of what I got out of it. But you read it later in life, and you say, this is it's unbelievable. It's amazing. And especially, here's the thing, with St. Paul's Outreach and your rootedness in your faith, and you look at it through the lens of your Catholic faith, and even if Shakespeare meant it or didn't, what are you seeing? What are the messages that have those echoes of all those things I've talked about? It's like the lights go on, and you say, I now know. For instance, let me give you an example. I don't know if they're going to start sweeping here really quick. Do I have 1 second for an example? One of the most famous scenes in Hamlet is where Hamlet's holding the skull of Yorick the jester. Okay, if you think about Shakespeare, it's an iconic scene of a man holding a skull, right? Think Shakespeare, it's the playcraft and all this. So just primer. Hamlet's the Prince of Denmark. His father, the king and mother are married, king and queen. His father gets killed by his uncle who comes in and marries his mother. And that happens within 30 days of Hamlet's father's death. Hamlet's brooding. He doesn't know what to do. This is crazy. My dad's dead. My uncle is now my stepfather. This is awfully weird. And then Hamlet encounters his father who tells him the truth about this. And for the entire first half of the play, Hamlet is he doesn't know what to do. He's vacillating, to be or not to be. He's vacillating. He has no direction. He goes abroad, he comes back, and there he sees this gravedigger digging and digging and digging, and throwing bones and skulls out everywhere. And he's like, what are you doing? You're kind of desecrating the ground. Whose grave is this? And he says, what's Yorick's? And Hamlet feels like he got stabbed in the heart. Because Yorick was the jester that took care of Hamlet when he was a little boy. Yorick is the guy who, when mom and dad were running the kingdom, he was his alternative dad. Yorick gave him piggyback rides and kissed him and hugged him and loved him. And here's Yorick's body just being tossed aside. And Hamlet picks up his skull and he says, "To what base uses do we return, Horatio?" He says to his friend. Is this it? And it's a memento mori moment, right? Remember that you too shall die. And in that moment of recognizing I'm going to die at some point, it was a concentration of his mind that I have to do something. I can't vacillate anymore. Now, whether he did the right thing by going and killing is debatable. But the long and the short is he was motivated to get off of his haunches and live and act his life out. So my whole point is, and I'll say this one last thing, a little bit on the side, and it's going to come back to the point about the reading. Once upon a time, I made a list of my priorities. Many times I made a list of them. I'm a list guy, right? And the top of the list was faith. Faith, family, blah, 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 okay? Constantly. And then one day I realized faith can't be the top of the list. Faith has to be the lens through which I look at everything. It's the lens through which I look at the list. It is not one among many. It is the lens. So everything else that I have in my life that's important has got to be not just topped by faith, everything has got to be informed by faith. And so we are about the business in here, in Roca Seca, at St. Thomas, in your own personal interior life. We are about the business of crafting a lens of Catholicism to look at the world, to look at our families, to look at our directions with the notion that, what would God have me do? We're informed by a Catholic sensibility. We look through a Catholic lens. So I promise, if Father will even be kind enough to give me his email, after tonight he's like, I don't want an email from that guy. I'll send a list of books if you're so inclined, and I would just commend them to you, and I think you will eat them up. So thanks for asking. Yeah, thank you. Don't get too far.
You can stay right there. I'm really glad that you clarified that was an Ignatius press. I thought that was the Spark Notes Kingly there, but I'm glad that's the real thing. So I just wanted to thank you for your presence and thank you all. I did want to ask one question, and it's kind of going back to the journal question. What is the topic of the issue that's being worked on right now?
It's this one right here that came out is suffering. Which I think if anyone wants to come out and take a look at it, I think you'd really like it. And the next one that's coming out is on Pope Benedict XVI, just a devotion. And then the fall is education. So we have a lot of great thinkers and scholars and so on that will be writing. So each it's a quarterly journal, and each has a theme. So suffering now, Benedict XVI in summer, education in autumn.
Well, Dr. Warner, thank you, and you've heard it here, so we've got the inside scoop on what's coming, but it's exciting, and we're grateful for your friendship, grateful for your words, grateful for your presence. As I kind of wrap up, I just want to encourage you to leave your email addresses if you want to join our efforts and be aware of what's going on. I want to encourage you to take some cards, take some holy cards, take a business card to stay in touch with us or to share with a friend. We've got lots of flyers and posters and different things, trifolds, so take them to your friends who weren't here. And again, the content of tonight will be shared. Our next regular Roca Seca activity is going to be a novena seeking the intercession of St. Mary Magdalene. If you know anything about St. Mary Magdalene, her feast day was recently lifted up and elevated to become a feast. It's July 22nd, so some of you seniors will be blissfully on your way into the real world. But we will be praying for St. Mary Magdalene's intercession. She's the apostle to the apostles, a very, very much an Easter saint, but she's also the patron saint of the Dominican order. And so I know Father Litke is happy to know that we have a devotion to St. Mary Magdalene. You can find our 8 patron saints on our website, rocasecaproject.org. And I just want to encourage you to follow us, be friends with us, come around. Homecoming, we're always going to be doing something on campus, a rosary walk encircling the campus. We always do a Candlemas celebration on February 2nd. And we always have some kind of a spring lecture, intellectual formation opportunity. We held a very wonderful panel discussion on the question of Catholic identity in the university. That's available on our website, and I believe at St. Thomas's YouTube channel. It was a very well-attended event in the South Campus auditorium, and Father Bill Miscampbell facilitated a panel and gave a keynote that really was exceptional and has gotten a lot of conversation going on and around the campus. So certainly commend to your attention various things. Watch for our emails. And we're going to conclude with the prayer here of St. Thomas Aquinas. There are so many prayers that he wrote. One of the great gifts that I was given when I was confirmed was a little prayer book of St. Thomas Aquinas. English on one side, Latin on the other. I stuck on the Latin side, and I love being able to pray Thomas's prayers in the language that he wrote them. But let's just bow our heads and ask that what has been said tonight would penetrate and possess us and lead us into all truth. We know that Thomas, with all that he had going for him, with all the gifts that he'd been given, he understood that he was nothing apart from one who was pursuing the Lord. When he was asked what he would have as a reward, he said, "Nothing but you, O Lord." So let us pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Grant us, O Lord, an ever watchful heart, that no capricious thought can lure away from you. O Lord my God, bestow also upon us understanding to know you, zeal to seek you, wisdom to find you, a life that is pleasing to you, unshakable perseverance, and a hope that will one day take hold of you. May we do penance here below and patiently bear your chastisements. May we also receive the benefits of your grace in order to taste your heavenly joys and contemplate your glory. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. If you listen closely, the narrative was there in that prayer, and how beautiful that is from our patron to God's ears. So let us go forth with strength. Please stay and mingle a little bit as the snacks are still there. Grateful for the occasion, grateful to, in a very special way, Taylor, and to our friends from the Roca Seca Project, as well as from Tommy Catholic. I would say a great success. To those who are graduating or are wrapping up the school year, know of our prayers. Let's stay in touch and go forward in pursuit of God's call. Good night and God bless.